interview with Mike Wallace for 60 Minutes last night. Nancy Reagan said, as she said before, that she turned to California astrologer JOAN QUIGLEY after her husband was shot and wounded by John Hinckley, that she heard QUIGLEY had forecasted. But Mrs. Reagan flatly denied QUIGLEY had any influence on U.S. policy, but she acknowledged that she did have influence on the timing of presidential events. But QUIGLEY sees herself as much more of a mover and shaker in the Reagan presidency. Mike Wallace questioned closely JOAN QUIGLEY about what it was she did for Nancy Reagan.
She would call you and say, what's a good date for a news conference?
Oh, yes, every news conference, every speech, except there were a few exceptions when it was an emergency and it had to be done right then. But I did almost all the speeches, and then when Air Force One would take off with the president, I always did that.
What do you mean?
Well, the takeoffs and landings. You see, it would ensure not just the safety, but the success of the trip. I mean, there were many times that I did that. And it's fabulous being able to work with Air Force One, because you can say, you know, do this at 3 minutes after 6 and they'll do it.
You would call Mrs. Reagan.
No, she would call me. She would ask me, for instance, what are the best times for the president to do this or that, and I would say this time would be dangerous, or the outcome would be bad at a certain time, and I would just really pick the times that they did things of great importance. Sometimes I didn't, but most of the time I did.
And how often would this go on?
Well, it varied. As necessity dictated, but toward the end, around 87 in the fall, when the Washington summit was so important and all of us were working so hard for it, then Nancy would call me, 2 or 3 times a day sometimes. And
ask you what?
Well, there was so much scheduling to be done for various things, and then it's very important when something like the INF Treaty would be signed to do it at a very good time. And I was working terribly hard at that time. I did work.
Are you serious, Miss Quigley?
What do you mean, am I serious?
I mean, the wife of the President of the United States would call JOAN QUIGLEY and would talk to her for a couple of hours on the telephone.
Yes.
And would talk about what time a treaty should be signed, the INF Treaty, for instance, or what time Air Force One should take off.
Yes, but I'm a very good technical astrologer, and I know how to schedule time. I also affected definitely the relationship between the superpowers because of my reading of Gorbachev's horoscope. The minute I read it, I knew that I had to change the evil empire attitude before they had their first summit, and I went about that. I talked to Nancy for 2 or 3 hours, convincing her that Gorbachev was the kind of man that was not only tough but intelligent, open to new ideas, and that he had vision like Ronald Reagan did, and that these two men had a fantastic chemistry between them. And I went into that at very great length, and I also chose the time when Air Force One would depart from Geneva.
Do you still do any astrological work for Mrs. Reagan?
No, I haven't heard from Nancy since the news broke, and she didn't want me to meet the media, and I told her I wouldn't harm her in any way, but I just had to appear because I wanted to represent reputable astrologers properly.
And so you've had no contact with
Astrologer JOAN QUIGLEY in an interview with Mike Wallace. And that's part of This and Other Worlds tonight. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. See you tomorrow. Good night.
This is CBS.